All right, Barb, do we want to go ahead and get started this afternoon?
Sure, Grayson, that's fine. I'm ready whenever you're ready.
All right. Well, thank you all for joining us for webinar part 2 for our Oklahoma Airport System Plan update. For those of you that attended the first one, you'll remember the beginning of this spiel. It's very similar to the economic impact study that we undertook several years ago, as well as our pavement management system update. We must have good data to get the end result that we want out of the studies that we are doing. We've had some pretty good success of getting information from you all. So thank you for those that have participated in the surveys, the calls, the interviews, so on and so forth, but that must continue. This is going to be an active process for at least the next 6 months, maybe 8 to 10, potentially moving into the 2022 calendar year. So today, what we're going to discuss is airport roles. You've known for 20 years, we really had 3 categories: regional business, district, community. You've heard other roles or classifications out there. The asset system came out with some classifications back in 2012, 2013. And really, that's what part of this, a major part of this system plan is doing, is taking a look at our current roles. What do the roles need to be for moving into the next couple of decades? Is there an opportunity to increase the amount of roles? I don't know that we can decrease. I don't know that we can go from 3 to 2, but certainly we could look at going from 3 to 4, or maybe even 3 to 5. And so that's what Barb is going to talk to you all about today, is kind of a little briefing as where we're at with the airport roles. Some of the thoughts that we're looking at based on the data that we have received from you all. And we hope that you'll be excited to hear the news and hopefully participate as we continue down this flight path of updating our system plan and figuring out where our airport system is going to go for the next couple of decades. So with that, Barb, I will let you take it away.
Okay. Turn my So for those of you that were with us during the first webinar that we had a month and a half or so ago, you might remember that we talked about the process that we're going to go through in the aviation system plan. And it's not terribly unlike an airport master plan in the fact that we start off with inventory, then we do a forecast. What is different is this next task that we're going to talk about today, which is the roles analysis. The roles analysis is a really important part of the aviation system planning process because it's used for 2 different things. First of all, once we have the roles established, those are used to help us understand how well the system is currently performing. Where might it be adequate? Where might it be deficient? Or in some cases, maybe it's even duplicative or overlapping. So before we can make those determinations, we need to know what roles each airport is playing. Also, then once we have the roles established, we come up with facility and services that should ideally be in place at each airport given its role in the system. So that's the gist of what the airport roles do for us and why it's very important to our overall analysis. When you look around the state of Oklahoma with 108 different system airports, it's not it's not very hard to figure out that airports serve different types of activity and they have different types of customers. Also, the airports all serve different types of communities. So it's those differences in terms of who are the airports serving and what is the community like that the airport that's serving that help us determine what's the appropriate role for each airport in the state airport system. So it's the role that really helps us relate to the airport, to its customers, and to the community that it serves. And I'm not advancing. There we go. As Grayson said, the state roles for your airports were first established in 1999. That's light years ago in terms of aviation. And at that time, the 3 roles that were established were regional, business, district, and community. Since 1999, the aviation industry has changed considerably. And in addition, FAA's guidance on airport system planning has also changed. When the roles were established in 1999, there was some thought or some anticipation that some airports that were assigned a certain role, the airport might grow into that role. So it was important for us to go back and look at the conditions today and see what has really happened. Also, the FAA, excuse me, when we developed the scope, was encouraged OAC to take a clean slate approach to this and to revisit the airport roles starting from scratch. So that was the approach that we took and how we undertook this analysis. Excuse me. As many of you know, airports in Oklahoma, many of them are anyway, have a federal airport role. If you're included in the National Plan of Integrated Airport Systems, NIPIAS, then you do have a federal role for your individual airport. And those federal roles are important because they make you eligible to compete for federal funding from the FAA. Out of the 108 airports in the Oklahoma airport system, 9 are currently not included in the NIPIAS. And that's something that we're looking at through the planning process. Are there airports that are not included that maybe should be considered for NIPIAS inclusion? So that's something that we're looking at and something that we'll talk about as part of our next webinar. For the federal roles, those weren't established until 2012. That was the first time that FAA had ever taken the opportunity to look at different roles that general aviation airports play. By the time FAA got around to doing that, almost every state had established their own state roles because it's just intuitive that all airports are not of equal importance or equal contribution in the system. And so states took the initiative on their own to assign their own roles, and then FAA came back and also developed their own roles for general aviation airports. The FAA roles consider primarily 2 things, the type of activity that each airport serves and the volume of activity the airport serves. For the federal roles, for airports that are included in NIPIAS, the roles are national, regional, basic, local, excuse me, and unclassified. Unclassified was a role that was added later in the process. And what FAA found in looking at the airport system was that some airports that were included in NIPIAS actually had fallen below the basic level at which an airport can be included. The NIPIAS guidelines call for an airport to have at least 10 based aircraft. There are a number of other criteria that they look at for NIPIAS inclusion, but that's one of the primary ones. And so through the asset process that Grayson referred to, FAA discovered that there were actually, and it's not just in Oklahoma, almost every state has airports that are included in the NIPIAS that now fall below that 10 based aircraft minimum. So those airports have, at least for the time being, been included in what they call the unclassified category until such time that they might again have 10 or more based aircraft. And then they would move up into that local category. Federal roles and state roles for airports are not required to match. You can play one role in a state system and another role in the federal system. And most often when we do a state airport system plan, we do look at the relationship of state roles and federal roles. And we find that they don't always match, and it's not necessary for them to match. One of the reasons for that is the FAA, when they do their role assignment process, they just really consider activity. That's the one factor that they look at. For the role assignment process that we did for Oklahoma, we did look at activity, but we looked at things like facilities, services, the community characteristics, the economic contribution, and a number of other things that are important from the state perspective to determine if the system is meeting its transportation and economic support objectives. So in some instances, we have state rules that are similar, and in other instances, the rules between the state and the federal classifications are not always the same. But that's not surprising, and it's not a requirement. For the process that we went through in Oklahoma, and it was a very extensive process, the first thing we did was to identify a series of factors, which we'll talk about here in a minute, that help to determine whether the airports are meeting the state's transportation needs and its economic objectives. Once we identified those factors, then we came up with a series of indicators by factor that we could actually give a score or numeric value to. So a lot of the role assignment process was in fact based on numeric scoring and ranking of the airport system. Once we had the factors and the indicators in place, we then worked with Grayson and Nick and the rest of the staff to determine if in fact any of those indicators should have a different importance weighting in the scoring process. So that was something that we considered. Once we had that framework in place, then we went through and gave each airport a numeric score of some sort for each of the indicators that we were looking at. Each airport's total, all factors then and indicators. Each airport had a total score, and the graph here on this slide shows how the airports were grouped and ranked and eventually assigned to one of 4 role categories. The 4 categories that we came up with in this process: national business, regional business, general airports, and then community airports. And we'll talk a little bit more about the factors that we used and ultimately where everybody ended up in that ranking process. For the factors that we considered under the demand category, we looked at total based aircraft, which came from 5010. We looked at total annual general aviation operations, which we got from a number of sources. We looked at the total number of business jet operations, which we got from an FAA database called the National Offload Program. And then we also considered each airport's percent of their business jet operations as a percent of the total operations at the airport. We also looked at various facilities and services. How long is the runway? What type of approach does the airport have? What's the airport reference code for the airport? Does the airport have an air traffic control tower? And what kind of fuel is available at the airport? So those are some of the other factors that were scored and went into determining what role category the airports would be in. We also looked at characteristics for the communities that serve each airport. We looked at the historic rate of population growth or decline for each airport in terms of where it's located in the state. Same thing for employment. And then we looked at the projected rate of growth or decline in population or employment for each airport service area, so that we could tell, which airports have been have service areas or communities that have been growing and which have had service areas that are declining and which are expected to have the more significant growth going forward. So we wanted to align the airport roles with these community characteristics. Then we had a number of other factors that we looked at. How supportive is the community of its local airport? What's the general size of the community? Because obviously larger communities typically would be served by larger, more active airports. We looked at the federal role, if that was applicable as it's identified in NIPIAS. We looked at whether or not the airport was considered business ready. And in order to do that, we looked at guidelines that have been established by NBAA, the National Business Aviation Association. And then we also looked at the economic impact of the airport as it was reported in Oklahoma's statewide economic impact study that was completed a couple years ago. So using all of those factors, we gathered data on each airport. Each airport received a numeric score for each one of those factors or indicators. The scores were all summed. And in the end, we grouped all of the airports as was shown on that previous graph. They broke in logically into 4 different categories. And those categories going forward, the airports will be either included in a category known as national business, regional business, general, and community. Previously, there had been only 3 categories. We increased that to 4. We added that new category for the most part, national business. According to a lot of industry sources, large general aviation aircraft that are over 50,000 pounds maximum takeoff weight are the fastest growing segment of the general aviation fleet. So we wanted to make sure that Oklahoma was equipped with a system of airports that could accommodate larger business jets. And that was the reason that we added the national business category. So for the national business airports, the airports that are included in this role, the runway length objective for those airports is a minimum of 6,000 feet. That will enable those airports to support nonstop flights to almost all domestic locations and also to some international destinations. The national business airports should have public terminal facilities that are fully equipped. They should provide Jet A fuel and have a full complement of FBO services. They should be, their primary runway should be supported by a full parallel taxiway, a precision approach, and a precision approach lighting system. The national business airports have significant economic impact and almost always serve one of the larger communities in the state. For the regional business airports, their minimum runway length objective is 5,000 feet. These airports still serve a wide variety of business jets. They should also have a full parallel taxiway and a precision-like approach. So that means they can have either an ILS or an LPV approach. These airports primarily serve medium-sized markets throughout the state. They also are able to support nonstop flights to most domestic markets and some closer international markets. These airports have notable economic impact to the community they serve. They have a public terminal. They also have Jet A fuel, and they have at least some FBO services. For airports that are included in the general airport rule, their minimum runway length should be 4,000 feet. These airports are primarily serving the smaller mid-sized markets throughout the state. These airports are capable of serving a full range of twin-engine general aviation planes and smaller business jets. They're primarily suited for more regional travel throughout the U.S., and they do have some sort of public approach, a public terminal, and have at least 100 low-lead fuel. For the community airports, most of them, their ideal runway length would be somewhere in the neighborhood of 3,200 feet. The community airports typically serve smaller and rural communities throughout Oklahoma. They have a little bit of a more limited economic role, and they're designed primarily to serve smaller twin engine and all types of single engine aircraft in the role that they've been assigned in the state airport system. This map just shows you geographically throughout the state where the role, where the airports end up in terms of the roles that they've been assigned. Following this meeting in the next couple days, OAC will be sending out something to each of the individual airports to let you know your assignment within the state airport system. So where do we go from here now that we have the airport roles assigned? As I said in the beginning, the airport roles are really important because they form the framework that we use to evaluate the performance of the existing airport system. What is its current adequacy? Do you have deficiencies? Do you have gaps that need to be resolved? And the airport roles that have been assigned help us to make that determination. Also, something that we're working on now is a step that we call the facility and service objectives analysis. For each of those 4 roles, national business, regional business, general, and community, there's a comprehensive list that we've established working with OAC of facilities and services that should ideally be in place at each airport. And so what we're doing now is using the inventory data that you all furnished and some of the data that we got from OAC and then also from FAA, and looking at each airport to determine if it currently has facilities and services in place that meet the objectives that are established for its individual role. Where we identify that there are deficiencies, then we'll be identifying what project or actions are needed to make each airport fully compliant with their respective objectives. Those actions or those projects then become part of the recommended plan for the airport system, and those are used then to help OAC just determine what needs to be implemented to raise the bar in terms of future system performance. We're pretty much on track with the project schedule that we established early on. We have pretty much finished the inventory. There are a few remaining special inventory elements that we're in the process of working on right now with Lochner Engineering. We expect that those should be completed by the end of the month. The forecast was completed some time ago and submitted to FAA for their review. This roles analysis, which is the next task, we have pretty much wrapped up, and that's what the focus of our presentation today. We're using that information now in our system evaluation task, which we've been working on for the last few months. We anticipate that that'll be completed in late July or the first part of August, and that the next webinar that we have when we bring you guys up to speed on terms of where we are and what's going on will be to talk about that system evaluation. How adequate is the current system? Where is it deficient? And also, do we have parts of the state where we have duplicative or overlapping services that are being provided? And all of these things are important for OIC to understand and know so that they can make good investment decisions going forward about how to best improve the system and make sure that it's really meeting transportation needs and economic objectives that have been established in Oklahoma. So that's where we are in the process. I think our next slide here is just to entertain any questions that you might have. And as always, Nick is really the place that if you do have questions after we get off the phone today, you can always get more information from him on where we are in the study or what the study is saying about your individual airport. So with that, we can go back to any of the slides if you have particular questions or discuss any questions that you might have about the roles analysis.
Thank you, Barb. Appreciate that presentation. I know we only have a few airports here on the call right now. Any questions or comments from the group? Any of the consultants that are listening in for your airports? We're doing this for you. This is not something we just do for ourselves. This is for the greater system, making sure that we have what we need identified and that we have it in the right spot and that we're going to make the right investment decisions. This is also going to help us in our cause up the state capitol when we go talk about needs and investment needs, and that we have X dollars of investment that will occur, but we are having this delta of difference between what we can invest and what the needs of the system are. And that's going to help us, we hope, educate our lawmakers as to why they need to continue to invest in airport infrastructure in the future. So this is important for many different reasons, for you all, for us, for the state, for communities, for companies. And so we have multiple different angles that we plan to capitalize on this effort and utilize this effort. And like I said, this is a once every 2 decade kind of an opportunity. This is not something that happens every so often. And so if you're with us today, that's, at the end of the day, that's the important thing. And hopefully participating as I would expect, and providing that inventory information and get that to us as we move on down the line. So I'll stop there. Any questions or comments?
Hey, Grayson, I just had a question maybe for Nick or Barb one, but what does our participation look like thus far? I know this week is probably this month is pretty tough with people finally getting out and traveling. So I wasn't necessarily surprised at seeing a light turnout, but because I know I've been in contact with quite a few airports, or trying to, and there's a lot of people on vacation. But as far as the overall turnout for information you're sending out, are you seeing a pretty good response so far?
Yeah, we've actually had a really good response. I mean, we've been at this, Paul, since, I don't know, I think we started actually contacting people beginning back in December. And we've kind of done this in 2 waves. We had one wave of surveys that we sent to all of the airports to collect what I'll just call the basic system planning data. Anything that we already knew about from OAC or from FAA, we didn't ask you guys to regurgitate that to us. We focused on trying to just get the new information that we needed, or any specific information that we needed to do the system evaluation and the facility objectives and some of the things that we've talked about. In addition to that first wave of inventory data, Lochner has been doing a number of what I'll call specialized inventory efforts. They're not always things that we do in a system plan. We sometimes do them, but they're pretty heavy duty. We've been collecting information on RPZ ownership, RSA standards for about 30 of the larger airports. We're collecting information on properties that are available for development, that we're going to be sharing that data with the Department of Commerce. And we have also done a more heavy, in-depth look on terminal buildings and hangar facilities that are available at the airports. I would say we have probably right now about 90% of all the information that we need. I know Lochner is not quite finished. Keenan's been running into what you said, kind of people out instead of at the airport that he needs to still speak with. But by the end of this month, either through the airports and additional follow-up that we'll do, or working with Nick, we expect that we'll have 100% of the data that we need to do the analysis. Some of it's been a little kicking and screaming, but for the most part, people have been really good about supplying the information. And I think that's because they do understand that it's in their best interest to help us identify all the need, because when we can show that the need is far greater than the money that you have to meet the need, that helps Grayson in his efforts on the state level with the state legislature to try to get more money and more funds appropriated. So people have been pretty good, and we're pretty close to having rounded up everything we need. We might have one more swing through to some of the people that haven't provided 100%, but we are pretty close.
And then just to follow up with that and add to what Barb was saying there, Paul, I think in terms of, putting a number on it, I haven't followed up with Keenan on kind of where he's at with his. I know he's been doing pretty well on getting his information, but in terms of the basic system planning information that Barb referred to in that first wave, I think honestly after it was right after and around the February winter storm, so that kind of made things a little bit chaotic. But once we got a little bit further away from that event, I think by the end of the day we got to somewhere between 5 to 10% at most of the information that we needed not being returned to us. And the good thing about that is I think that with those communities and those airports that hadn't gotten back to us, some of those are in between maybe city managers or even airport managers or were at the time. And so luckily and thankfully, we have the vast majority of the information that we were hoping to get back from them we have that on file, so we'll be able to put that into the system. And then as we do the final review, we can go through that information with, those folks that are now, hopefully firmly seated in their positions at that time, so that we can make sure and double check and ensure that we have that information correct. But for, like I said, 5 to 10% max of the information that we are missing on the basic system plan information. And then one thing, Grayson, that Andrea pointed out, we do have one question here in the chat box here, and this comes from the Durant Ops folks. Thank you for joining today, but they asked, what are the chances of getting possible state funding with the placement of an ILS? I think there's probably a little bit more to that than just the funding aspect, but Grayson, is that something you might be able to fill for us real quick?
Yeah, so regardless of whether or not there's state funding, we've been told there will be no more new ILSs installed at GA airports anywhere. With the last one that was installed that was new, i.e. not a replacement, was Wiley Post in 2010. At that time, that we heard that statement from FAA at that time, and we've inquired again probably about 5 or 6 years ago if that had changed, and the answer at that time was no. As you know, everybody's going to satellite-based navigation and in near ILS capable GPS approaches. And so I think, as opposed to spending any money on an ILS system, which it's kind of a moot point at this juncture, it would be improving the WAS approaches to get those ILS minimums. With a WAS approach, obstructions clear, and a MALS rail system, you can get a 200-foot and a half-mile minimums pretty easily. So to answer that question for Durant, the funding is not really the key emphasis there. The item is whether or not FAA would actually install an ILS, even if we came up with the money. And so the emphasis moving forward would be, how can we get ILS-like minimums at airports that have those longer runways, that need that increased capability as we move into satellite-based navigational systems.
And just to kind of follow up with that, and some of the items that Barb was mentioning in terms of the minimum, not necessarily requirements, but the minimum goals for those types of those different roles. That's why, we have ILS and, precision like in there for that particular reason, because we realize that, trying to install ILSs at all of the airports that we have that listed under, or we wind up having listed under the national business category, we understand that that's not necessarily going to be feasible to put ILSs everywhere. So that's why that goal will probably, we've had that discussion and continue to have those discussions on how to really characterize those goals and whether or not they're actually feasible. Obviously, we don't want to put goals that are unachievable into the system plan. So thank you, Grayson, for that. And of course, do we have anybody else that has any questions?
Seeing none, this is recorded, has been recorded, so we will send it out at the end of this briefing for those that weren't able to attend, so they can watch and review. But thank you all for joining us today, and look forward to the next webinar. Barb, you said that was going to be toward the end of July, first part of August, do you think?
Yeah, that we're just waiting for, well, a couple things. We're doing a few follow-ups on height zoning with a few airports and communities, and then we're waiting pretty much just for the results of the final results for the RPZ and the RSA analysis, and then a few things that we need to talk with you guys about the NIPIA stuff. And so I would think certainly by the end of July we'll be ready for the next update, which will be to talk about the results of the system evaluation.
Thank you, Barb. Appreciate it. We'll see everybody at the next webinar. Thank you for joining today, and have a good rest of your week.
Thank you guys for attending.